In Reno, Nevada, 2 unidentified women are found dead. Can tiny fibers tie them to their killer? A skeleton, a shopping bag, and a single button are investigators' only clues to the identity of a woman and her killer. A sailor is killed on a Florida beach. Only a tire track in the sand marks the path to justice. The clues to murder often elude the naked eye. But no killer can escape the telltale traces of guilt. Reno, Nevada is known as a betting town. In February of 1995, someone gambled he could kill without a trace. A transient man was searching a dumpster for things he could sell when he made a gruesome discovery. Officers from the Reno police arrived and retrieved the body of an unidentified woman. It was almost completely camouflaged among the debris. For police, the myth of the perfect murder was dispelled long ago. Today, forensic science can win convictions from the most minute clues. But in this case, the killer seemed almost to be playing the odds. He could have disposed of the body in the desert, where no one would ever find it. Instead, he crafted an elaborate parcel, conspicuous because of its size, and hoped the dumpster would be empty before it was found. The complexity of the shroud was disturbing. The victim had been slipped into several large plastic garbage bags, which had then been carefully sewn inside a sleeping bag. The bundle was then wrapped in yellow plastic and tied with rope. The initial examination of the remains was made by the lead investigator, Detective David Jenkins.
That degree of packaging was unusual because of its complexity, and immediately suggested that there had been a lot of preparation and a lot of time involved in the packaging of the body. And that's uncommon in most body disposals.
Right away, this elaborate wrapping gave police several important clues. The killer needed time to encase the victim like a modern mummy. And he needed a very private laboratory where he could do his grim work. To identify the body, detectives reviewed recent missing person reports. One case stood out. With family photographs and fingerprints, police confirmed that the victim was Catherine Powell. She had disappeared the Friday before the body was discovered.
Her disappearance was first reported that next Monday, 2 days later, when she failed to show up to work. Miss Powell was an elementary school teacher, a very popular teacher. She was loved by her students and the other staff. And so immediately when she was reported as missing, there was a sense of urgency, both by her staff and by her family, who felt that her disappearance was far more sinister than just her not wanting to arrive at work.
At her home, police saw no signs of forced entry or violence.
This is basically how you left it.
But when her family looked over the apartment, they noticed several items missing, including a laptop computer and printer, a camera, and her purse.
Did she went over to take care of things?
Yeah, she used to, she could tell. She's
While detectives combed her apartment, forensics investigators pored over the evidence from the dumpster. If the wrappings held a clue to the killer's identity, investigators couldn't find it. They had never seen a case like this before, and the killer's attention to detail made them nervous. Investigators focused on the remains. The ropes and wrappings were preserved for later analysis. Police were not even sure how the victim had died. There was no indication of fatal trauma on the body. Forensic science would have to tell the story. And for an expert eye, there were many trace clues to read. The Washoe County Sheriff's Forensics Lab assigned the case to investigator Rich Berger.
I don't really recall having attended an autopsy where there was such a profusion of trace evidence potential on a person's body. There was apparent a number of blue-green strings and tufts of material located basically from head to toe.
Besides the fibers, Berger found a single metal shaving tangled in the victim's hair. None of these traces matched the fibers or samples gathered at the victim's apartment. Police suspected they were linked to the killer. The victim's body also bore telltale bruises. It appeared that she had been bound, gagged, and possibly tortured. The injuries suggested the killer was male. But new information suggested he hadn't worked alone. While forensic pathologists continued to gather the minute physical evidence, Detective Jenkins studied Powell's credit card records. Any recent charges might shed light on where she had been. He saw that her card was used to buy a $2,000 stereo on February 5th, the same day she disappeared.
Exotic looking.
Yeah,
wide,
she was kind of exotic.
The clerk said he'd chatted with the woman who bought the stereo. She had claimed to be Powell.
They identified themselves as Miss Powell. They were making a purchase to give to their daughter during a wedding. We were aware, having spoken with Miss Powell's family, that Miss Powell had no children.
The clerk told police this woman did not fit the victim's description. He also recalled a crucial detail: the kind of truck the woman drove. Detectives traced it to its owner, a cable television installer named David Middleton.
That break allowed us to focus our investigative efforts specifically on an individual rather than just the overall circumstances involving her disappearance and the use of her credit cards.
Police interviewed David Middleton about Catherine Powell. Though he had recently installed cable service in her home, he said they had talked only briefly.
Do you know a lady by the name of Kathleen Powell?
He claimed ignorance about her disappearance and murder. He knew nothing about her credit cards.
What's your profession? What do you do for them?
But a background check revealed that Middleton was a convicted felon and a former police officer. While on duty in Miami, Middleton had lured a young woman into his patrol car, drove her to a secluded place, and sexually assaulted her. Stripped of his badge, Middleton served 3 years in prison. Upon release, he moved to Colorado and then to Nevada. Middleton's girlfriend was charged with fraud for using Catherine Powell's credit card. But because Middleton's truck was used in the crime, police now had grounds to search his home.
We found a firearm, a shotgun. Mr. Middleton in the state of Nevada, because he is a convicted felon, was prohibited by law from possessing that weapon.
Possession of the shotgun was a felony. But while it was cause for Middleton's arrest, it did not implicate him in Powell's murder. Police found no fiber evidence at his home to link him to the crime. Middleton was interrogated again. This time he changed his story. Now he admitted to beginning a sexual relationship with Catherine Powell. He said that he had been with her one night, then left for an hour. When he returned, she was dead. He refused to offer any more information. Middleton was now a prime suspect in Catherine's murder. But investigators had not a scrap of real evidence to link him to the crime. At the Washoe County Forensic Science Lab in Reno, the fibers found clinging to Catherine Powell's body were leading investigators nowhere. Desperate for clues, they re-examined the bruises on the victim's body. Right away, they focused on one in particular. It had an unusual crescent shape. Suspecting it was a bite mark, Detective Jenkins sought the help of forensic odontologist Raymond Rawson.
Well, I saw just a few pictures of a body that had been autopsied, and there was a bruise on the left chest area, just almost to the armpit. It was a bruise that stood out from anything else on the body, so and it had the characteristics of a bite mark.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
Hoping this mark would lead them to the suspect, X-rays and plaster impressions were taken of Middleton's teeth and sent to Dr. Rawson. He wondered how hard a person would need to bite in order to leave a bruise like the one found on the victim.
And if you see that, it leaves an indentation. Now, there's no bruising, and we found that you have to actually bite so hard that you can't stand it to create a bruise. So when we see a bruise on the skin, we know that there were at least 200 pounds pressure, and that wasn't a willing situation. Somebody would cry out in pain.
Next, Dr. Rawson compared Middleton's bite pattern with the bruise on the victim's body. He placed the X-ray of the biting edges over a photograph of the bite mark. The details of the X-ray matched the bruise.
We had one tooth that had a wear pattern on it, and that wear pattern was shown in the bruise. So it was a very good match.
The bite mark confirmed that Middleton was with Powell near the time of her death. A bruise this severe was no playful love bite. But neither was it evidence of murder. Police needed more concrete evidence. As news of the case spread, an anonymous informant called the police with a potential clue. Middleton had rented a large storage unit in nearby Sparks, Nevada. A search warrant was immediately served there.
That information was significant because for the first time we were able to locate a specific location where the kinds of activities involving the packaging of the body and the keeping of the body could have occurred.
A storage unit would make a perfect workshop for a killer. Even before detectives entered the shed, they were suspicious of the amount of recent activity there. The entry records, obtained by Deputy District Attorney Tom Deloria, showed how often Middleton visited the unit.
Well, we know from the gate entries, which was computerized at the storage facility, that Dave Middleton made numerous entries into that storage unit the Friday evening that Kathy Powell was abducted from her residence, Saturday, again Sunday, again Monday, again last entry being Tuesday morning.
Were police walking into a glorified closet or a killer's lair? They knew their case against Middleton hinged on what they found here. At first, the shed was unremarkable, crammed with personal property. And anywhere else, the duct tape and coils of rope would have seemed harmless. When they found the stereo receiver that was purchased with the victim's credit card, they knew they were onto something. Then they found the items missing from the victim's home. But police already knew Middleton had been to her apartment. Evidence of burglary does not prove murder. The handcuffs were perhaps a souvenir of Middleton's police days. But the scraps of women's underwear and a stun gun were not so easy to explain away, especially in light of what they found next. A refrigerator lay on its back. The freezer's bottom had been cut away, and small, jagged air holes had been drilled into the sides. It had been modified, apparently to hold a human body. Above the refrigerator dangled a system of ropes and pulleys strong enough to hoist a human being. The detectives could only begin to imagine what perversions were acted out here.
This was a torture chamber, simply put. The refrigerator, having been placed on its back, almost suggested a coffin.
But did Middleton's depravity go as far as murder? Investigators still had to link him to the victim. In the refrigerator, they saw small blue-green fibers and human hair. As clues, they provided a glimmer of hope in a room full of horror. The refrigerator was brought back to the crime lab, where Rich Berger analyzed the fibers. To him, the threads in the refrigerator appeared to match those found on Powell's body, and genetic markers from the hair were consistent with the victim's.
The fibers from Powell's body were 100% cotton of a blue-green color, and that similarly those from the refrigerator were composed of 100% cotton and the same color. And that also the metal fragment from Catherine Powell's hair matched the metal and paint that went into the makeup of the freezer compartment of the refrigerator.
The metal shaving found in the victim's hair matched the metal from the crude air holes. Investigators found the link they were looking for. The trace evidence proved that the victim was in David Middleton's storage unit. Detectives now formed a theory of how she died. The air holes were simply inadequate to keep her alive. She had suffocated. While investigators were grappling with the monstrous acts of David Middleton, they learned that Powell may not have been his only victim. On April 9th, a man was walking his dog outside Verde, Nevada. He found the skeletonized remains of a human being. They were entangled in knotted ropes and plastic garbage bags. Police brought the remains to the crime lab. Criminalists compared its DNA to a sample from an unsolved missing persons case. They made a positive match. A check of dental records confirmed the victim's ID. She was Thelma DeVilla, who worked at one of the larger casinos in the area. She had been missing since August 8, 1994, the exact day Middleton had rented the storage shed. The excessive ropes, knots, and garbage bags found on DeVilla's remains mirrored those found on Catherine Powell's body. The knots provided information about the victim's final hours. The stresses applied to the knots showed that both women were alive when their hands and feet were bound, and they had struggled desperately against the ropes before they died.
We specifically looked at knots from two different murders and compared them to each other, showing that the same types of knots had been used in both these deaths.
DeVilla's DNA was then compared to the DNA traces found in Middleton's shed. The results were ironclad. Like Powell, she had been in the shed. But the DNA traces of several other people were also found there. If David Middleton was a serial killer, Powell and DeVilla were the only victims ever found. As the case against Middleton was prepared, the grim sequence of events leading to Powell's death became clear. Middleton, working as a cable TV installer, had probably gained access to her home under the pretext of checking her cable service. He then subdued her and took her to his storage shed. There, she was tied up, brutalized, and kept confined in the airless refrigerator. Sometime during this torture, she died. Middleton methodically wrapped her body in plastic garbage bags, sewed it into a sleeping bag, and enshrouded the bundle with yellow plastic bound with rope. Finally, under cover of night, he disposed of the remains in the dumpster. Police were fortunate the body was ever found. But Middleton didn't realize that a brimming dumpster would appeal not only to him, but also to a transient looking for scraps. He had been clever up to a point. The investigation uncovered the fact that Middleton had installed cable service in an apartment near Thelma DeVilla's home the week before she disappeared. And on the day of DeVilla's disappearance, a neighbor remembered seeing Middleton near her home. On September 15, 1997, the jury convicted David Middleton of 2 counts of first-degree murder.
Without the DNA evidence, without the trace and fiber evidence, without the metal evidence and experts, and most importantly, the testimony of our pathologist, we would have had no case. Without the trace evidence, we had nothing.
This evidence was so compelling that Middleton was condemned to 2 sentences of death by lethal injection.
Dave Middleton is not your typical killer. All I can say about this guy, as opposed to most of them, is certainly he's police smart and he's street smart. And when you have that, that's a dangerous combination.
Whether murder is committed in an urban jungle or far out in the countryside, some trace of the deed will be left to tell the tale. March 22nd, 1988. Deep in a forest south of St. Louis, there began one of the most baffling cases ever encountered by the Missouri State Highway Patrol.
And try to determine whether it's an Indian grave or it's a fresh grave, or It appears that it's been here for some time.
The case concerned fragments of a human skeleton. Was this an innocent, ancient death, or the victim of some monstrous modern crime? It would take some of the most specialized skills in forensic science to decide.
16 feet.
Sergeants Don Bazzelli, William Conway, and D.W. Kreitz were among the first on the scene.
I received a phone call from the ranger at the Boy Scout camp who advised me that he had discovered some skeletal remains. I went to the scout camp and he directed me to the gravesite.
The investigation had its origins 4 months earlier. Raimo Pitkänen, a surveyor from Finland and former Eagle Scout, had been hired to make a map of the SF Boy Scout ranch. On November 2nd, 1987, he made an unwelcome discovery. Frightened of becoming involved, Pitkänen told no one what he found until just before his return to Finland.
Well, Interpol had the Finnish authorities contact the gentleman in Helsinki and conducted an interview with him, which was sent to us in Finnish, after which we had to have translated.
For nearly a week, investigators combed the site. Pickings were thin, a skull and lower jaw, a few strands of dark hair, and an assortment of bones, some scattered several hundred feet from the grave. Many showed tooth marks, signs they had been chewed by animals.
It's a very shallow grave. The bones, doesn't look like we're going to have many bones in it. We're finding on the outer perimeter a couple of bones that may belong to what we've got here. We're going to have to look into it. There's not much to go on right now.
But as the investigation continued, clues slowly began to emerge, including a plastic shopping bag.
We first thought they could have been an Indian burial site, but then when we excavated the grave, finding the service merchandise bag and determining that it was probably from 1979 to 1985, finding that down in the grave really helped us.
There was another clue, one which would eventually narrow down the identity of the victim, a single metal button. Stamped across its face was a logo, Texwood. The next few weeks were frustrating for Conway and his colleagues. Preliminary investigations suggested the remains came from a young woman, perhaps 25 to 30 years of age, the mother of 2 or more children. Surely someone had reported her missing.
Well, the victim was first identified as a Caucasian female, and we started checking missing person reports on Caucasian females, and there were quite a few that fit the approximate age and size and weight of what we had.
In fact, this victim should have been especially easy to identify. She had perfect teeth.
The skull and the remaining teeth indicated no dental work and no cavities, which is very rare in our society, and we were able to eliminate a number of the suspected missing persons that we were investigating.
Soon, the investigators had eliminated all the missing persons from Missouri and from a half-dozen surrounding states. The skeleton in the woods was not a missing person, or rather, no one had reported this young woman as missing. The investigators decided to try another approach. They contacted forensic anthropologist Michael Charney at Colorado State University. He had a remarkable talent for identifying individuals from the most fragmentary skeletons. With near miraculous skill, he could often reconstruct the age, sex, and race, even the facial appearance of a missing person.
I said, wait a minute. The first thing that hit me is that this was not a white person. This was Oriental. This was somebody of Mongoloid extraction. American Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Eskimo, something of that nature.
Charney had picked up on something the police investigators missed. White people and black people have relatively long, narrow faces. people of Mongolian and Asian heritage have much broader faces. Meanwhile, police investigators were making progress of their own with other physical evidence from the grave. Their attention centered on that button with the curious Texwood logo.
We thought when we found the button it would be an easy thing to identify. The word Texwood being on the button, we called Texas, trying to find someone down there that might know it. We found all kind of manufacturers with the name Tex and Texwood in Texas, but nothing would match. Finally, we called U.S. Customs. Within a couple hours, got a call back to contact an agent in New York who put me in touch with the representative of Texwood, who they manufacture the jeans, the blue jeans, in Hong Kong, and they're called the Levi of the Orient.
Texwood sold jeans exclusively in the Far East, slender cuts specifically designed for Asian figures. The police's portrait of the victim was growing clearer. More important, it matched the picture given by Michael Charney, a slim woman, Asian, in her mid or late 20s, a mother of 2 or more children. The likelihood of the victim being from Asia dramatically narrowed the field of possible victims. But who was she? One of the many leads police pursued involved a missing person in Georgia, an Asian female. Officers investigating the case obtained a photo of the woman, which they sent to Charney. Michael Charney's approach was simple in theory, but tricky in practice. Take a photograph of the skull and superimpose it over the image of the possible victim. The fit must be exact if an identification is to be made. Would Charney and his colleague Nita Bittner be able to match the police photographs to the skull found in the woods at the Boy Scout camp?
In this case, when we got the eyes and the nose in close proximity, the nose still doesn't match. It's too broad. The cheek depth is too far apart or not far enough on one side. The teeth are a mismatch, and the chin is still out of place. After trying and refocusing for size and other distortions, we were still unable to come up with a match.
By now, every attempt to identify the victim had failed. Charney had one last suggestion: recreate the woman's face. The reconstruction of a face from a skull is among the most specialized and most spectacular skills in a forensic anthropologist's arsenal. It begins with mathematical precision. A collection of round rubber pegs of varying lengths glued to a plaster cast of the skull.
And there's another one that goes right
The pegs are landmarks, each identifying the thickness of soft tissue at particular points on the face. Next, the pegs are connected with strips of modeling clay. Bit by bit, humanity returns. Plastic eyes are placed in the sockets, and the skull comes to life. Careful modeling, perhaps dabbing with a damp sponge, gives the texture of skin. Paint, a black wig, will complete the transformation. For the first time, we can glimpse the victim face to face.
In doing a facial reconstruction, it's not as important that it's absolutely accurate, but that it gives a glimpse of who the person was to somebody out there who will hopefully recognize it. When we do our facial reconstructions, it's generally a last-ditch attempt.
Now, would anyone recognize the face rebuilt by Michael Charney's team? August 24th, a photograph of the reconstructed face appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. 3 days later, 2 informants claimed that the photo looked like their friend, Bunchi Nyhuis. A mother of 2, she was a native of Thailand. They had not seen her since late 1983. Bunchi had a husband, Richard Nyhuis, an ex-GI whom she had met in Bangkok during the Vietnam War.
When we first talked to Mr. Nyhuis, he appeared to be an upstanding citizen. He maintained a nice house by himself, clean, very upstanding citizen in a nice neighborhood. He was gainfully employed, full-time. He was raising 2 sons on his own. They attended church, were very good students.
Nyhuis had a ready explanation for his wife's absence. In December 1983, he and Bun Chi had a series of bitter arguments. She had insisted on leaving him and their 2 sons and returning to Bangkok. It was a story the officers didn't entirely believe. The way to resolve the matter was to eliminate Bun Chi as the victim in the forest grave.
He was very cooperative. He provided me photos out of their photo album of his wife that we could use if we needed to in the investigation.
The photograph was not ideal, but Michael Charney did his best.
Like any photograph at an angle would be, you have to get it in the same 2 planes exactly, you see.
Despite the difficulties of matching the position of face and skull, in the end, Michael Charney had no doubt that this was Bun Chi.
We first received word from our lab that Dr. Charney had matched the photographs of Bun Chi Nyhuis to the remains that we had recovered. And at that time, the case took on a whole new outlook. We now knew who our victim was, and we also had a good suspect to start with in Mr. Nyhuis.
The investigators quickly uncovered a series of incriminating facts. Richard Nyhuis and his wife frequently had noisy arguments. He had taken several days off work in December 1983, the same time his wife disappeared. Soon after she vanished, Nyhuis divorced Bun Chi and removed her as a beneficiary of his insurance. And then one final damning discovery.
We ultimately discovered that he was a Boy Scout leader, which then tied right into the fact that her remains were found in a Boy Scout camp. He had been actively involved with Boy Scouts with his children for many years.
By now, Richard Nyhuis was the primary suspect. The investigators decided to invite him in for further questioning. They chose their moment with care. A weekend when Nyhuis was camping at the SF Ranch, not far from where his wife's body had been hidden. The officers informed Nyhuis the remains they had recovered had been identified as those of his wife. Nyhuis admitted he had pushed his wife, who had fallen and hurt her head. When she threatened to call the police, to leave him, taking the children with her, he bent down, put his hand over her nose and mouth, and held it there until she was dead. Then he hid her body in the freezer.
The reason that we weren't getting any hits out of the computer files is that the victim's husband never reported her missing. He said that he took her to the airport and she went back to Thailand, but in fact he murdered her. Kept her in his house, in the freezer, 3 months, and then took her down to the Boy Scout ranch and buried her.
Richard Nyhuis was convicted of first-degree murder. He is now serving a life sentence without parole. Time and the elements had taken their toll on Bun Chi's body, adding to the difficulty of finding her killer. But even just a few hours can make the difference between solving a case and losing the trail forever. In September 1983, 2 friends near Jacksonville, Florida were shocked to find the body of a man. He lay on his side at the foot of a sand dune. His head showed severe wounds. Investigators from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office quickly responded. They found no identification on the body. The only clues were a broken pool cue and footprints leading to some tire tracks in the sand. Police worked carefully to gather and protect all the evidence. The tire tracks seemed like the most promising clue to lead to the killer. they were lucky to have it. Rain, the slightest breeze, or one false step could destroy the fragile traces. Preserving the tire tracks required particular expertise. The very act of making a cast could destroy them. Police called the Jacksonville Regional Crime Laboratory and forensic criminalist Ernest Ham.
So the crime scene was processed with these tracks in mind. The footwear tracks and the tire tracks were photographed. Then we want to make a plaster cast, because a plaster cast will give us a true representation, a three-dimensional representation of the object that made it.
Care in the pouring was crucial in order to prevent the weight of the plaster from destroying the print. If the evidence were altered, a killer might go free. After the plaster had set, the cast was carefully cleaned. Now, police had a perfect three-dimensional reproduction of the tire tread. It included the gouges and signs of wear that made that tire unique. But millions of tires roll on America's highways today. It seemed impossible for investigators to find the one tire that had made these tracks. They studied the plaster cast, noting the ribs and grooves of the tread design. Despite the odds of finding the tire, it offered investigators their best chance to catch the killer. Matching the track with a tire on a suspect's car would be as conclusive in court as a fingerprint. Ham searched through thousands of photographs in the pages of the tread design guide to find the one tire he needed. As Ham searched for a clue to the killer, another jogger found a clue to the victim. The wallet belonged to a 21-year-old sailor serving on a ship docked at the Mayport Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. An officer from the ship was called to the morgue. He confirmed that the victim was Jeffrey Michael Russell. An autopsy was performed on the victim's remains. He had been beaten, probably with the pool cue found at the scene. It bore no usable fingerprints. He had then been shot once in the head from less than 2 feet away. The pathologist recovered a .357 caliber bullet from the victim's brain. Russell's shipmate said he was well liked and had been out with friends on the night he died.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Police speculated that the victim might have even shared a round of drinks with his killers. He was last seen leaving a party, planning to hitchhike back to base. While the police traced the victim's movements, Ham continued his arduous, time-intensive search of the tread guide. Finally, after reviewing thousands of images, he found the single tire that matched the cast. The track at the beach was made by a tire commonly mounted on pickup trucks. Now, police knew what they were looking for, though it hardly seemed to advance their investigation. To find one truck out of thousands in the Jacksonville area would be daunting. But then police got a lucky break that saved them hundreds of hours. An officer, answering a call about a robbery, pulled over a suspicious truck. The driver tried to run off, but was soon apprehended and arrested. His name was Gregory Kokol. Police inspected his truck. they found a gun under the seat. Kokol was known to police. He was a suspect in a murder case several years before, though never charged. But his name had come up even more recently. Police had just received an anonymous tip that Kokol had bragged of robbing and killing a man on the beach. The gun retrieved from the truck, a .357 revolver, was the same caliber used to kill Russell. The officer then noticed that the tires seemed to resemble the ones involved in Russell's murder. Until now, solving the case had seemed like a long shot. Now, police had the prime suspect and possibly all the evidence to convict him. To make the charges stick, they'd have to link him to the scene of the crime. Police looked to the tires to make that connection. An officer compared Kokol's right front truck tire to a photograph from the tread guide.
The way he described it was that the hair stood up on the back of his neck, that he was really seeing what we told him he was going to see.
The tire was the brand and model they were looking for. But police were not certain it was the same tire that left its mark at the beach. Ham's work wasn't done. He still had to find the exact section of the tire's tread that had made the print. He scrutinized every inch of the tread, looking for cuts, gouges, and wear that matched the portion captured in plaster.
These are the marks and gouges that are put into a tire as you drive it. These will leave what we need for making a positive identification. This makes this tire unique.
But every mile driven since the night of the murder put new wear marks on the tire and altered the old ones. Even if Ham had the exact tire in his lab, it might be too late to make the perfect match. A killer could still go free. Jacksonville police were building a murder case on a foundation of sand. Now they needed harder evidence. After careful analysis, investigators found marks in Gregory Kokol's tire that matched the casting made at the crime scene. But police needed to prove that Kokol himself was there. They hoped Kokol's .357 would provide the smoking gun they needed. If this was the exact gun that fired the fatal bullet, investigators had to prove that Kokol pulled the trigger. Ham performed 3 tests designed to link the gun with the crime.
Our first examination will be a visual examination, because we want to see if there's any other sort of trace matter on the weapon before we subject it to some sort of processing techniques, such as, in this case, because it's a head wound, if it was a close head wound, we could possibly have tissue blowback into the weapons.
But this test was a dead end. No tissue or blood was found on the gun. The next step was to test it for fingerprints. The gun was sealed in a glass cabinet and exposed to fumes of cyanoacrylate ester, or common superglue. These fumes adhere to fingerprints, making them easier to see and compare.
But based upon the individual characteristics of the ridges, the endings and the divisions and the dots, we can make a positive identification from any part of the body that bears friction skin.
The fumes did their work in just a few minutes. The print on the gun was compared to Kokol's prints at his arrest. They were a perfect match. This one fingerprint only proved that Kokol had held the gun. It did not prove that this gun had fired the fatal bullet. That could only be determined by a ballistics test. The test-fired bullet was placed side by side on a microscope for comparison with the bullet that killed the victim. The investigator lines up the rifling patterns on both bullets. A video monitor allows him to see the minute scratches on the soft lead. If the marks align, he has proof that the same gun fired both bullets. And that's precisely what he saw. The scratch marks on both slugs were identical. Investigators had found the murder weapon. As the prosecution prepared for trial, the events of Russell's final night came into focus. As he hitchhiked back to the base, he was picked up by Gregory Kokel and a friend. But instead of dropping Russell at his quarters, they drove him to the beach, beat him, robbed him of the only dollar he had, and then Kokel shot him. Crimes committed by strangers on strangers are the hardest to solve. But the scratches on the bullet, the fingerprint, and the tire tread bore the traces of the killer's guilt. Close forensic analysis pulled them together to make a solid case against Kokel.
The weapon was the weapon that fired the fatal shot. The fingerprint belonged to the individual that was suspected of committing the crime.
The senseless, random nature of the murder assured that Gregory Kokel and his accomplice would receive stiff sentences. Forensics proved beyond a doubt that Kokel fired the fatal bullet. He was sentenced to death. His friend was deemed an accessory to murder and received 14 years. For years, only the most obvious evidence could be used to solve a murder. Today, scrupulous collection methods by police and rigorous evidence processing by forensics experts are helping to assure that nothing gets overlooked.